and staff. We can have a look at that one in a minute, but let me now move to the main part of this first bit of the session. We're going to have a look at this briefing paper, and you'll be able to download it later on at the end of the webinar, so you will have that. But the paper, as I said, looks at the issue of suicide and how organisations deal with it. And it came from 3 particular colleges, Loughborough College, Strode College and Highbury College, that worked together to produce some guidance, some thoughts about how organisations should deal with this. And we're really lucky today because we've got Sarah Outram who's coming to join us. Do you want to come and join us, Sarah? Just coming along here. Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ruth. Nice to be here.
Good, good. So this is Sarah. She comes from Loughborough College. And Loughborough College, as I said, was one of the colleges that was involved in producing this paper. Sarah has a particular role within the college. She is the mental health coordinator, which means that you deal with the learners that have any kind of mental health issue, distress and difficulties, and also work a lot with staff as well, I believe. Yes. She comes with a good pedigree. Not only because she's worked a lot in FE, but she's also worked a lot in the adult community sector, and prior to that was also a psychiatric nurse, so she's well versed in the issues that we're going to be discussing and helping us to probe a little bit around this paper and how, what it's got to say to us. So let's have a think first of all, Sarah, about this concept of a whole organisational approach. We use it a lot now, don't we, this whole organisational approach. What does it mean to you at Loughborough College? Because I know you've done a lot of work around safeguarding, haven't you? So tell us a little bit about what you think the whole organisational approach means to you.
Yes, Ruth. Well, I'm going to talk you through 2 documents that we've been working with at Loughborough College. The first one is dealing with students in distress, which I believe you're making available to people.
Absolutely.
That. And that came from bottom up, really. Staff were coming down to student support services, unsure who to refer to, what to refer, when they should intervene, what interventions they can make, where the boundaries are. So in response to that, we came up with this document that would help guide them through that, and it's in 2 halves. So the first half is about students in distress and how to deal with them, and at the back we've got a referral sheet with all the actual contacts in college, which is something people could replicate in their own organisations, I think. Okay. Actual named people or phone numbers and titles at least. So there's how to respond to students in distress, where to take them when you can see problems emerging, all kinds of problems, not just mental health, but a lot of them are around mental health. And then what to do in a crisis.
Right, okay.
What we discovered was that we needed to not just produce this document, but we needed to take it out and train people to use it and show them what was there so that they would feel confident, because you need that knowledge in advance of a crisis happening, really. So we targeted particular teams, and that was we talked to the equality and diversity people, we've talked to health and safety people, we talked to individual teams, and also we took it up to management as well, so that they could see what we were doing with this.
So what you've highlighted there for me is the importance of all areas of the college, but particularly perhaps key areas, coming together and having a common approach. And I think that chimes with the information that's in the briefing sheet, which looks at, I'm going to show you this slide because I think it's quite helpful, which looks at the interrelationship between mental health, well-being, health and safety, equality, diversity and safeguarding. They're all linked, aren't they?
They are,
yes. And it's important that those people who have responsibility for those areas work collaboratively across the policies, across the procedures, so that there is a net, if you like, across the whole organisation,
yes.
Which obviously is one of the key principles of developing a whole organisational approach.
Yes, and it sounds obvious when you put it up like that and we talk about it, but I don't think it's necessarily in place until you think about it in this way. Yes.
Well, and I think it's partly because it's quite difficult to achieve.
Yes.
But I think what we can learn from that is that what we need to do at the very least is we need to get all these key people together to get some common understanding, which is why I started the webinar thinking about what we mean by safeguarding, so that we've got some common view on what we're trying to do. Thanks for that. I'm thinking, moving on, because I'm trying to reflect some of the bits that are in the paper that will be of use to you and highlight them to you. I noticed, and I'm sure you did too, that this last week there's been quite a lot of information from the National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, which has highlighted the huge problem that we're getting with depression, particularly in young people. People as young as 5, they're saying, are suffering more and more with depression, and obviously our young people, you know, they are at a difficult age. It is an age when there's a lot of change and challenge to them, and they are vulnerable potentially to depression and stress related difficulties.
Yes.
And I think that's partly why you decided you would come up with this policy to try and help people to understand what they should do to support those learners.
Yes.
Yeah.
We need everybody to have that conversation, to be aware that this is a growing issue and that we need to be supporting our learners if we're going to retain them in college and help them to achieve.
So one of the difficulties, it seems to me, as you know, if you're a non-expert, is how everyday staff, people around the organisation, whatever type of organisation it is, can begin to identify potential problems, potential people at risk. Any advice on that?
The very best thing, of course, is getting to know your students and listening to what they say. What they tell you is key, I think. So taking the time out to listen to people properly, not to make judgments, not to impose your own thoughts on what depression is or what a diagnosis means or whatever, but to take your lead from the student and the other key people around the student. So it could be other students, or if you've got LSAs or people like that are in the classroom that have sort of got their ear to the ground. And you want to be aware of changes in appearance, crises, times in the student's life, if something's going on at home, if they're leaving care. Maybe it's coming up to exam time in college. These kind of trigger factors that you need to be aware of, and just think about what could be affecting people.
So it's very much really, I suppose, then about kind of developing an antennae, if you like, that is out there, possibly, you know, just noting what's happening, changes in people, what people are saying. And I think that, you know, you raise an important point there about other learners, because often other learners are aware of things that we're not, and they tell you things or they allude to things, and it's about being aware of those, isn't it, really? The briefing paper itself does list some of the other things that we can think about, but that's a really good start, so thank you for that. I think one of the difficulties for people is understanding what they should do when they perhaps identify. I mean, we're obviously in the business here of preventing people take their lives, and in doing that it is about recognising that there might be a problem and doing something about it. But what should they do? Where do people's roles differ, do you think? Where are the boundaries?
I think very often tutors particularly have that initial relationship with the student. The student may well confide in them and tell them things. So they need to know what they can and can't deal with. So if it's something that can be dealt with fairly simply, a phone call home to mum or whatever, and just that's it, end of, record it with your manager, that's fair enough. But if it's going to require more investigation, if there are safeguarding issues, say, then that has to be passed on. And it's about knowing in advance who you would contact and knowing where your boundaries are. Not saying to the student, here's my mobile number, for instance, and give me a ring any time, which I have actually heard. And part of the training here is to say that these are your boundaries. You know, that you need to know who to pass it on to, and out of hours you need to know where to go as well. So
that's really important, isn't it?
It is. So the key people in your organisation that can help, but also things like helplines, GPs, those kind of people that you can contact.
And I think in the briefing paper there's a list of organisations and agencies, isn't there, that will help people. And I noticed also on your policy responding to students in distress, there's a list at the back.
Lines,
So it's just about people being aware of all that and knowing what their responsibilities are, and when it's beyond their responsibility or their comfort zone, if you like, and therefore who they need to go to help that student, to help that situation. Okay, so we've got to a position where we're thinking about a student who perhaps has not, you know, maybe not been able to find the support that they need for whatever reason, or they just decide that they are going to, they're so overwhelmed that they do take their life, maybe because we were unaware that they were in distress.
Yes.
But that's a really difficult situation in an organisation. It could be a learner, it could be a member of staff. It does happen. How do we respond? What should we be doing?
Again, I referred to 2 documents at the beginning, and there's the other one that we have implemented at Loughborough College, and that actually came from top down, and that's, again, it's about knowing who has what role within that to begin with. Right. So you have to respond immediately when something like that happens, and contain it and look after everybody that's involved as much as possible. So it's knowing who's going to liaise with the parents or other people that are involved. It's knowing who will talk to the press, and it's then dealing with your staff and students and making sure that they are reassured that they know who they can talk to within college and outside of college, and having a timeline of when things are done. Again, we had a run through, and hopefully we will do again, where we've had a mock sort of death of a student. How would we respond? It wasn't necessarily suicide, but it would be the same process for whatever.
Yeah, it's like a major incident, isn't it? What you do.
Test your systems, see if they work.
Yes, which is
see where the gaps are.
Yeah, I know at the time it might feel it's a waste of time to do that, but of course you never know when these things are going to happen and when you're called upon, and obviously having that experience helps people to know what they should be doing, doesn't it?
There's no substitute for knowing what you're doing from having done it and knowing that it works. It's like fire procedures, you test them out.
And I know that although you've not had experience of a learner committing suicide, you have had experience of a learner who attempted to commit suicide, didn't you? And
we have.
How did you manage the aftermath of that and deal with that crisis when it occurred?
It happened in a very busy classroom, and there were 2 other students trying to stop this student. She was making her way to the window as though to jump out, which she wouldn't have been able to do. She didn't know that. And so it was in front of about 30 other students as well, so it was very traumatic. But this student was already known to me and the counselling service, so we were able, one, to deal with her, to go in immediately and comfort her and take her down to the counsellors, get the help she needed outside of college, get her safely home. And then there was the other half, was, as you say, supporting the people, other people that were around. So it was going back in, first of all to the staff that had been involved and checking they were all right and knew what their roles had been, and to reassure them they'd done what they could. And then to talk to the other students and see how they felt, tell them that we have the counsellors available if they wanted to talk in college. They found out peer support. There's nothing better than that they were very good at looking after each other. This particular group were art students, and they decided to come together and make a card to wish the student well.
Right.
And so she wouldn't feel too unwelcome and awkward to come back in, because I think that was a big concern for her and for them, how they were all going to react when that happened. And I think, and that would also apply if it had been a successful attempt to actually make a card of condolence or a book of remembrance for the family, or something that can focus positively on what's happened. This is obviously a very negative experience, but it gives you something to do around it.
I suppose it's about giving people the opportunity to deal with the aftermath and the emotions in a constructive and managed way, hopefully, isn't it? Rather than just trying to pretend it hasn't happened. And again, that's part of your procedures that Loughborough, I know, and also is talked about a lot in the paper that we've been discussing this afternoon. Obviously, part of the reason we've raised this topic this afternoon is because it is World Mental Health Day later on this week. 10th Thursday, I think. Tell me a little bit about what you think is going on in relation to World Mental Health Day.
Well, hopefully there are lots of events all over, but things are very localised as well as national. So I would advise people to look at the World Mental Health Day. Just Google World Mental Health Day 2013. Also the Time to Change website, which I hope people are aware of, and if not, they should familiarise themselves with, because it's a big campaign going on between run by Mind and Rethink, 2 mental health charities at the moment, and it's all about getting people talking about mental health and about suicide. And it's a bit that raising awareness, and there's no substitute really for us all raising awareness, I think.
Excellent, that's really helpful. Thank you very much for that. I noticed that we seem to have lost a picture here, Sally. I don't know whether you're aware of that. but our screen is completely dead here, so I don't know quite what people are getting, whether you're able to hear me or see me. But obviously we've got a couple of minutes here where we were going to be asking questions, or offering you the opportunity to ask questions of Sarah while she's here. Just seeing if I can bring that back up. Yep, I think we have. I think it's just gone to sleep. So we're back here now, and hopefully you're all there. If you've got any questions, perhaps you'd like to send them in to us. You can do this by raising your hand at the top again, so that I know that you've got a question coming in, and we'll try and answer it for you. And one person's raised their hand. I think we've got some questions here. So you're just telling me here what we've got. Oh, yep, Helen's just telling me that she can see and hear us. That's great, Helen. Thank you for that. We've got a question coming in here. But what kind of questions do you get asked a lot? What kind of things that trouble people that you feel would be useful for people to know about?
I think counteracting negative attitudes is quite a common thing.
Right.
People can feel very threatened by somebody committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide or self-harming, and you get that all over. Even in A&E departments, you get negative reactions to people that have done this. So again, it's about training people, teaching them that people are not attention-seeking. They actually are making a point that they need help.
Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, what you're talking about there, it seems to me, is the fact that some people really don't understand why people might want to take their own life or harm themselves.
No.
And so, again, I suppose that in part comes down to training too, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
It's helping us all to understand that whilst it may not be something we would understand for ourselves, or, that it is part of the people that we're dealing with, and therefore we need to be aware and not judge.
Yes, and have that non-judgment.
Yeah, great.
Approach, yes.
Okay, I've got another question here. This is an important one. How should I react if a student tells me that they are thinking of ending their life, but doesn't want you to take any action?
Of course, you have no choice. You do have to take action. I think if a student's asking you that, they want something to happen. If they're telling you that. But from a safeguarding point of view, you have to tell the student that you have to pass that on, because it is not safe for you to keep that. Imagine the implications if that student did take their own life and you'd been told that and not passed it on to anybody. So it's about, again, knowing where to take that information.
What you raise a very important point there, which is to do with learners understanding your responsibilities, and learners having to understand that we have a legal duty.
Yes.
It isn't a kind of shall we, shan't we, that we are actually breaking the law if we don't pass that information on. And I suppose that means that as an organisation we also have a responsibility, because we need to make sure that learners know that, don't we, right from the start.
Yes.
So that they understand and they're clear about what responsibilities you have and what you should be doing and what you will do if they tell you certain things.
Yes.
So in this instance, it would be very much about telling the learner that there are certain steps that you have to take, and that you will progress that and get them the support or help that you feel they need.
In our counselling rooms, or the rooms where we see students in a planned way, we have the information up on the wall that if we think you or somebody else is at risk of harm, then we do have to responsibility to pass that on. But I would say that also to any student in a crisis, they say that you can't tell somebody what I'm about to tell you. You can't tell anybody. So, well, I can't make that guarantee. You know.
Great. That's a really important point. Thank you for that. There's another question. If we have a legal obligation, this is following on from the question we've just been discussing, who should we pass that information to?
You should identify who is the safeguarding person in your organisation, and that's where it goes to, and it's for them to then pass on the information to who they believe is relevant authorities.
So most organisations would have what we call a designated person or a safeguarding officer. Those are the two common terms, and it's those people that you should be passing the information on to. Those are the people that will make a decision about what you do next and who does what and who communicates. So I hope that answers your question, Jane. I'm looking at the time. One more if we have it. Otherwise, I think we'll be moving on. I've got a question, I think, coming in from somebody who's typing. Following on again, it says, sorry, if we are the safeguarding team, who should we pass that information on to? So beyond the safeguarding team in the organisation then, who are the people we're looking at who could support the safeguarding team within an organisation?
So maybe your local social care people that you need to know the contact numbers for, usually available on the council websites anyway. You should be able to get hold of that number quite easily, and it's usually, there is an out of hours service. It may be a police matter, maybe A&D, you may need an ambulance. You have to assess each situation and see who to contact. For students under 18, you would normally contact parents, but in specific circumstances you might not. There may be conflict with the parent or whatever. So the safeguarding team hopefully make an informed decision on who should be involved at that stage.
I think as well as the people that you've outlined there, we also have to remember the role of the local safeguarding board in your area. You should, as a safeguarding team, be very familiar with the local safeguarding board, key people, key phone numbers and such like. They are there to support and help you in your organisation. That is their role. So you should be able, shouldn't you, to be able to ring them up and ask for advice. I mean, obviously, if we're talking about a crisis situation like somebody's attempted suicide or committed suicide, then, you know, all the things that we've discussed would come into place. But if there's a real concern and you're not sure, there is the local safeguarding board there to help you as well as the people that you've talked about, police, social services and so on. That's great. I hope we've managed to answer your questions that have come in. Thank you very much for that. Sarah, thank you very much for coming along, and I hope people have found that useful. As I say, the document is there to be downloaded at the end. I'll highlight it for you when we get to the end, but that brings to the close this part of our webinar, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, so thank you very much indeed for that, and let's think a bit more now about the second part of our webinar this afternoon, where we're going to be thinking about some of the changes in the legislation, what they mean, and what are the implications for us, particularly around the vetting and barring procedures. So I'm going to be using the slides here for you, and again, if I've not said it, which I might have done, the slides will be available for you at the end, so you've got them to take away. Just briefly, I don't want to rehearse the whole history of where we've got to in regards to the legislation, but it is quite useful to understand the context, I think. You will be aware of the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act that came in 2006, and some of the big changes that happened following really some of the really high-profile cases that happened. You know, the Jessica Wells and Jessica Smith and Holly Wells, the two girls in Soham that were murdered, Victoria Climbier. You know, there's a whole raft, unfortunately, of cases that came about which prompted that legislation. But when the coalition government came into power, they decided they wanted to review some of the vetting and barring procedures, and they set about this by asking Sunita Mason to review the procedures, the planned changes that were due to happen in the vetting and barring, and to make some recommendations, which she did in a document called A Common Sense Approach. This was published in 2011. If you want to get hold of it, you can do, obviously. Some of the recommendations were to do with rationalising some of the bureaucracy, and one of the things that happened was the Criminal Records Bureau and the Independent Safeguarding Authority, who were separate, would be merged into one organisation, which has happened, and you're probably aware of that. We've now got the Disclosure and Barring Service. Now, in terms of setting up the Disclosure and Barring Service, they looked at some very key principles as to why they wanted what they wanted the organisation to be, and this slide tries to capture those principles for you. The first point was very much to do with trying to get a balance between civil liberties and safeguarding, keeping people safe, but not encroaching on people's civil liberties. So the vetting and barring procedures have been reviewed and refined to try and redress that balance as it was perceived. It was felt that it was out of balance, and the Disclosure and Barring Service have been working to redress that balance. Its key ideas has been to help support the recruitment process, and also to encourage employers to recognise that the vetting and barring checks are only part of an effective recruitment process and not the whole package, and it needs to be, the vetting and barring checks need to be seen as part of the whole recruitment process, not the only thing we do. It's been about reducing bureaucracy, and I don't think any of us would disagree about that. The importance of reducing bureaucracy. It was felt that it was over bureaucratic, over cumbersome, and the DBS have been working really hard to try and improve that, and that's why we're talking this afternoon about the update service, which I hope will help to reduce the bureaucracy and to make sure that we understand what are the appropriate vetting and barring checks that we need to take in an organisation. And I will spend some time over the next few minutes looking at that so that you are up to speed and you feel confident about what you should be doing and what kind of checks you should take with your new staff and existing staff. You can see the website address there for when you want to have a look at it. So let's have a look then at some of the changes that have come about through the legislation in the Protection of Freedom Act 2012. They changed the definitions of regulated activity for children and adults, and I'll talk a little bit more about that so that you've got those definitions, because they are absolutely key to this area of work. They've also produced some statutory guidance on supervision. That's quite important because sometimes we've got people in roles who are working in an activity, but if they're supervised by somebody who's been checked and that supervision is done appropriately and there are guidance on what that means, then they don't need to have the same vetting and barring checks. So that statutory guidance is very important, and again there's a copy of it at the end that you can download. They've changed the age at which somebody can apply for a check, so people have to be 16 in order to have a check. They can't be younger. So there are obviously implications if you are in a situation where you're working with younger people than 16, that you need to make sure that they are adequately supervised, because you can't put them through a vetting and barring check to make sure that they are okay to work in that regulated activity. Another important point to mention is the fact that a child is considered to be a child until the age of 18 in terms of this legislation. So if you are working with people who are below 18, they are deemed to be children, and therefore you need to look at the definition of regulated activity for those learners. Further changes. We have, they've introduced a more rigorously relevancy test. Sorry, tongue twister there. What that means is that's to do with the checks that the police do and the information that they hold on individuals and how that information is used and passed on. So they have refined that and made that more rigorous. They've introduced the right to review, so if people find that there's information on their DBS certificate, that there is a right now to review that and to challenge that if you feel it is inappropriate. Another key thing, which I think has implications for us as employers in an organisation, is that they will now only issue one DBS certificate, a single DBS certificate, and that goes to the applicant. It doesn't come to the employer. So that has implications for us, because we need to make sure that the applicants show us their certificate. That in itself might prove challenging in some instances, and we'll kind of look at this a little bit further on. And they've also launched the update service, and I'll talk to you about that in a second. Got a couple of slides here. I don't want to dwell too much on them, but you've got them to take away with you about what we mean by regulated activity, just so that you've got that information hard and fast for you. So in relation to children, what we're talking about, and if you remember under 18, we're talking about activities such as teaching, training, instructing, caring for or supervising or advising on the well-being and driving. Those are the key things that if you're doing them with those young people under the age of 18 is deemed to be regulated activity, and therefore you would need those people who are doing that activity with the learners to have an enhanced DBS check, including a check on the barring list, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about in a while. I also mentioned here in the second point that there are specified places. These are organisations who are deemed to be specified places because they mainly or wholly work with people under 18. So you need to have a think about your organisation, who you mainly work with, and whether you are a specified place because most of your learners are under 18. There's also a definition down here about how regularly and frequently an activity is done for it to become regulated activity. So that's another important point when you come to think about what checks you should do. You're thinking about what kind of activity are my staff doing, what age learners are they doing it with, and how frequently are they doing it. So those are some of the things that you need to think about. In terms of adults, you can see here we've got just an outline here of the activities that are pertinent to working with adults. Now there's a big change here. For those of you who've been familiar with this area of work, you'll know that there was a great long list of all the people that were deemed to be vulnerable adults. And it's important to know that that term vulnerable adults has gone. It isn't a term that we use anymore, and that might need to be reflected when you come to review any policies or procedures that you have, that we no longer refer to vulnerable adults. What we have are a list of, again, I suppose activities, things that happen with people that might make them vulnerable. So people are no longer in regulated activity just because they may have a disability. It will be because of the nature of the work that is being done with them. So if you've got people having personal care, people who offer social work, etc., as the list describes, they will then be in regulated activity. So for you, you need to be thinking about what do we do with our adults? What kind of activities do we do with our adults in order to see whether the staff are in regulated activity or not? I would think that in most cases, it's staff that work perhaps with learners with profound and multiple disabilities where you need to be thinking about having those checks because they might be offering assistance with their people's personal care or feeding and such like, eating. So why do these definitions matter? They do matter hugely because of the legal implications. There are things that we have to do by law and things that we don't have to do, and we can be caught out either way. So, for example, an organisation cannot knowingly employ somebody, put them into regulated activity if they've been barred from doing that activity because it's breaking the law. If you dismiss somebody or remove them from working in regulated activity because if they hadn't been removed they would have caused or there was a potential risk of harm, then you have a legal responsibility to inform the DBS about that decision. So that's about making sure information which is relevant if that individual were to move on and go to a different job is known to the DBS, and therefore they can protect future learners or adults. If you know that somebody has committed an offence, then obviously that information should be passed on to the police. I think it's just interesting to note that when I looked on the website recently, the July figures showed that on the DBS barring list that there are over 52,000 people, both children and adults, on the barred lists. So it is a substantial number of people there. Moving on, If you're thinking about the roles of the people in your organisations and you're looking at the definitions of regulated activity, then legally you have to ask for an enhanced DBS check with the appropriate barred list check, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And they should tell you, those checks will be able to tell you if somebody is barred, and if they're barred then obviously you can't place them in regulated activity. Types of checks, just a little quick reminder here of the types of checks there are, and depending on the role and the activity, you would be applying for one of these checks. The ones that I think are most relevant perhaps are the enhanced and barred list checks. Just talking about the barred list, let me just show you the next slide where it describes what we mean by those barred lists. This is quite important because you can only apply for a barred list check that is relevant to the regulated activity that the person is undertaking. So if you have a tutor who is working with under 18s, then they need to have an enhanced barred list check for children against the barred list for children. You can't ask for adults if they're not working with adults. If you've got people who are working largely with adults in regulated activity, then obviously you'd ask for the barred list check against the adults. And for those people who are working with both those types of learners, you'd be looking at both those barred list checks. But you need to be clear about what list you're applying, what checklist you're applying for when you fill in the request. I've got a little slide here as a kind of holding slide that you can go and have a look at later on, because I'm going to just talk a little bit about the update service, because it is quite an important change that's come about. And you can go onto the DBS website. There are two very short YouTube video clips, one for employers, one for applicants, that will describe quite succinctly and quickly what the update service is and what the benefits are for the update service. If you're not familiar with it, let me just give you a little bit of an idea. One of the things that was criticised was the fact that the checking process, the vetting and barring checks, took so long, people had to wait, and also that they had, if you moved around or you went into different organisations, you might end up with multiple checks, and that this was time consuming, costly, and overly bureaucratic. What the update service set about to do is to provide an online service whereby people can check the status of somebody's DBS certificate. For employers, the service is free, and what it means is that you can go online and check that the information you've got against some of your staff and their enhanced checks is still up to date and current. You have to do that with their permission. I can't stress that enough. You can't just do it as and when you feel like it. You have to have the person's permission, and that again gives you something to think about, because you have to think about in your organisations, how are you going to ensure that you've got people's permissions to do those checks, and when might you do those checks. It means that applicants and yourselves aren't filling in loads and loads of application forms, because once it's done, in theory, unless you change the type of activity you're doing, you should be able to just take that one check, that one certificate right the way through. Applicants can apply to become registered on the update service, and it costs £13 a year to do that. So again, that's something you perhaps need to think about as to who is going to pay that £13. So then, having registered, their information is on the update service and it's there for people to see. The value of the update service means that all this should become less bureaucratic, as I've said, and more streamlined. And so it's just come up on my screen, so I've just taken it off. And also, it would mean that the recruitment process should become much more fluid and flexible, much more efficient, and help you to make efficient and effective employment recruitment decisions. So perhaps after the webinar you might like to go and have a look at the YouTube clips. You can use them in training, you can use them with staff, and also there are various documents there that you can download which will give you detailed information about the update service and how you can use it and the benefits within your organisation. So take a look at those later on. These last couple of slides really are just some of the summary things that I've summarised some of the things that I've talked about this afternoon, which are around the implications for you as employers, and it's about some of the things here. How are you going to decide which roles require an enhanced DBS check? So that's about looking at all the activities, all the kind of jobs that are in your organisation and determining which ones require enhanced DBS checks and which ones don't. Because I can't remind you that we need to ensure that we're not asking for checks when we legally cannot. That is against the law as well. In terms of the recruitment process, when are you going to ask applicants to show you their DBS check, their DBS certificate? How are you going to do that, and when are you going to do that? And what's going to be your policy if people don't present those certificates? Will they be able to start their jobs? Will you employ them? What are you going to do about that process? Because ideally you need to have seen those certificates quite early on in the application and recruitment process, so that it's not bogging, you can get on with the whole business of what else is important about that person and taking up that role. So that's quite a key thing in terms of your policy and procedures. For existing staff and ongoing monitoring, you've got questions about, are you going to require staff to join the update service? And if you are, who's going to pay that subscription fee of £13? I talked a little bit earlier on about the online checks and doing those checks and when you might do them and how you're going to go about securing the permission of staff. And I think what you might want to do, following on from the discussions this afternoon and some of the information I've given you, is to think about your recruitment policy and what are the implications on your policies, and do you need to review those? Do you need to go back to them, think about these questions and think about what does that mean for your policy and practice? Because obviously that's what we're keen to make sure people are aware of. I hope that's given you some really good ideas about how things have changed and what's going on. We do have some time, just a few minutes now, for any questions, so please do feel free to come in with your questions. I'm not able to answer specific questions about a person in your organisation and what job they do and should we be checking them, because obviously that's quite a lot of detailed information, but I'll do my best to answer any questions that you might have. So please remember, you've got your little person at the top there with the hand. So click on that if you're going to ask me a question, and I'll try to answer it. So we've got a question here that's come in. When do you apply for a standard check, and when do you apply for an enhanced check? And that really depends on the role and the nature of the work. I made a note of this because I thought this might come up earlier on. And again, if you're dealing with in a situation where you're talking about regulated activity, it's an enhanced check. It's an enhanced check and a check against the barring list. The types of roles where you might have a standard check, let me see if I've got that information to hand. If we're talking about a standard check, what happens there is they'll do a check against the police national computer. All the checks check the police national computer, but the standard check just checks that. So, for example, an accountant, you would need to check for against the police national computer, and that would be a standard check. An enhanced check would be where you've got people, as I say, doing regulated activity. And what happens there is they do a check of the police national computer, the PNC. They check police information. You remember I talked about the kind of information that police hold locally, and when they're asked, they pass that information on. So that information would be checked. And then, depending on what kind of check you asked for, they would also check to see whether that person was barred against the children's list or the adult list, or both, if they were working in those activities. So it's a question of looking at the roles that you've got and determining which is the most appropriate check. I hope that answers your question, Christina. But you will find more information if you need it on the DBS website. And also you can phone, and I've got a holding slide in a minute. I'll put it up so you've got it there. You've got information here. You've got a helpline there. Now I ring the helpline quite often, actually, or the information line. If I'm not sure, I ring it and I give them my query, and they help me to unpick the rules and regulations, which is so do use that, or email them if you've got a query. Any more questions coming in? None at the moment. I've got one that somebody sent to me earlier on, which I'll just come back with you. Somebody asked me recently about the 3-year rolling programme of doing checks. If you remember, there was quite a lot of actually misconceived information that we had to do checks on all our staff. We had to renew our checks every 3 years. Now, that was actually a myth. That was never the case. There was never a requirement that we should do that. But of course, with the update service, we can check when we want. So that's why I'm suggesting that in terms of policy, organisations need to think about how often, how regularly do we need to do these checks, and then talk to staff and get their permission to do it. So I think that's the key thing, really, is just trying to determine what you think is appropriate in your organisation. One of the key things that all these changes have focused on is the need for employers to take responsibility for determining what are the best procedures that they need to have in their organisation that are relevant to the work that they do. And that, as I say, the vetting and the background checks are only part of the good safeguarding recruitment practice. But you need to work through that process in your organisation and to have a rationale as to why you've made those decisions. Okay, so we've run out of questions now, and we're getting towards the end of time. So I've given you that little advice and guidance holding slide there for you. Finally, let me just tell you, you can download all the documents that I've talked about and some more, and here they all are here. You can download them individually, or if you go to the options little box at the top there and you press it, you'll see that it's got an offer there to download all. So you can download all of those documents, and you'll see we've got the policy from Loughborough there, we've got the suicide briefing paper that we discussed at the beginning of this webinar, information on supervision, there's an overview of some of the changes. So I think I've given you a raft of documents, and the PowerPoint presentation for this afternoon is also there to help you and to support some of the things we've been talking about this afternoon. So thank you for that. If I go back to the slide, I'd also like to just highlight future training we've got coming up. We've got some face-to-face training coming up in Leicester. You can see there. So if you're interested in that, please do contact the events team to sign up. We've got some further webinars coming along in November and December, and you can get further information from the events team on those. Another thing which I'd like to highlight for you is we do have, we're working on at the moment a safeguarding survey, because we're wanting to find out what you think is important, what kind of support you want, what kind of events training do you need, What are the areas that are of interest to you? So we're asking you those questions in a survey. The link to that survey will be sent to you after the webinar, but you might also want to make sure that you at various points log on to the websites that are on the bottom there. The Healthy FE and Safeguarding website will have the survey on in due course, as will the Mental Health in Further Education website and the Equalities Toolkit website. So have a look at those websites as well. That's where we'll be keeping people up to date and making sure that new things and your views are represented. Okay, so finally, I think all I need to do is to highlight to you that at the end of the webinar, in a couple of minutes, there is an evaluation so that you can give us some feedback on the webinar and how useful you may have found it this afternoon. You can see also coming up in the chat panes that Sally's giving us links to websites, giving us the links to the YouTube clips that I discussed earlier on, so do take a few minutes to have a look at those, and also the documents there. So all there for you to go away and keep developing your ideas and thoughts and your good safeguarding and healthy FE practice. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope it's been of value, and I look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.